Thomas. And I'm Tom. And today we've handpicked for you a list of 10 influential Americans who have shaped America's economic, political, social, cultural, and technological aspects throughout the ages. But how could they affect my life? Well, stay tuned and you'll find out. First up on our list is Christopher Columbus, arguably the most influential of anyone on this list. After all, without the discovery of America, how could the United States have been created? Christopher Columbus sailed west of Europe on August 3, 1492. Had the crew known that he had miscalculated the distance that they were to sail by 137%, or 4,233 miles, they would have reconsidered if the monetary rewards were worth it. Columbus finally landed in America on October 12, 1492. Starved, seasick, and mutinous, the sailors believed that they had at last stumbled across the new continent of Asia, specifically India. Nowadays we know that he had actually discovered the West Indies in the Caribbean Sea. Columbus's discovery of America incited an emigration fervor. Each imperial country in Europe sought to colonize this new land and to reap the financial benefits which unique crop cultivation would bring. Although the Spaniards were the first to claim land in this new world, the British were soon to follow, and through settlement, intimidation, and fighting with local tribes and other European superpowers, came to establish the 13 colonies which would eventually become the United States of America. More importantly, Columbus took careful note of each of his discoveries, embellishing the great bounties of the New World. In the Barcelona letter written back to the monarchy in Spain, Columbus took great care to sell the New World to the royalty.
These islands are of beautiful appearance and present a great diversity of views. They may be traversed in any part and are adorned with a great variety of exceedingly lofty trees, which to appearance never lose their foliage, for I saw them as verdant and flourishing as they exist in Spain in the month of May, some covered with flowers, others loaded with fruit according to their different species and their season of bearing, the whole offering a spectacle of great beauty.
Okay, but how does any of this affect the present day? Well, almost uniquely to Columbus, as opposed to the other infamous characters of the time, he has a day in celebration of him, a day which continues to be a popular controversy each time it resurfaces. Oh, so not only did Columbus spearhead the colonial expansion to the New World, his anti-native sentiment still resounds to this day? I couldn't have said it better myself. Almost 200 years after Columbus, another forward thinker sought to colonize a section of the New World, albeit through drastically different means. Whereas the expansion started by Columbus utilized militant means to grow, the expansion proposed by William Penn was religiously inspired, seeking to create harmony between English settlers and the present native population. William Penn, as in Pennsylvania?
Precisely. The colony of Pennsylvania was devised by William Penn as a sort of holy experiment for the Quaker branch of the Christian Church. He desired to create a mutually beneficial relationship with the indigenous people of Pennsylvania, the Native Americans. In his letter, William Penn's Hope for Future Settlement, he writes to the indigenous people describing how his faith fortifies his pacifist ideals. There is one great God and power that hath made this world and all things therein, to whom you and I and all people owe their being and well-being, and to whom you and I must one day give an account for all that we do in this world. This great God hath written his law in our hearts, by which we are taught and commanded to love and help, and do good to one another, and not to do harm and mischief unto one another.
Our third influential person in American history follows this earlier trend of not actually being born in America. This influential immigrant was born in the British West Indies, on the small island of Nevis off the coast of St. Kitts. Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton came to America to study for a law degree. Thanks, Thomas, but I can take it from here.
After attaining his degree, Alexander became a lawyer, but it was clear that it was not to be. His fiery passion did not blend well with the cool-tempered court, so he quit his practice to advocate for the Revolution, dreaming of glory in the coming war. Although he never truly got the general position he strived for, he did participate in one battle, the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. After the Revolution, Hamilton went back to New York. However, when the Continental Congress invited him to participate, he hurried back to Philadelphia. He became a strong voice in support of the Constitution, becoming one of the nation's leading Federalists after writing the Federalist Papers. In 1789, after George Washington was elected president, he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. From that position, Hamilton was free to structure the framework of the United States financial system, and despite opposition from several prominent cabinet members and congressmen, managed to create one of the most enduring frameworks for a nation's financial systems to date. One of the most heavily contested topics was the concept of a system of credit to be established for the new nation. Hamilton published On Public Credit, claiming that a new line of credit should be established to justify and preserve their confidence, to promote the increasing respectability of the American name, to answer the calls of justice, to restore landed property to its due value, to furnish new resources both to the agriculture and commerce, to cement more closely the union of the states, to add to their security against foreign attack, to establish public order on the basis of an upright and liberal policy. These are the great and invaluable ends to be secured by a proper and adequate provision, at the present period, for the support of public credit. A champion of this nation's financial and political systems, Alexander Hamilton finally met his demise at the hands of his political and personal nemesis, Aaron Burr, in 1804.
Not to mention the biographical musical that Lin-Miranda created in 2014 to musically portray the lives of one of the most influential people in American history to date. And that is the end of our non-American section of influential people in American history. Our next influential speaker is Henry Clay, one of the greatest senators of all time, as claimed by a 20th century Senate committee. Henry Clay. The Missouri Compromise, the Tariff Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, that Henry Clay? The one and only. First coming to prominence in the War of 1812, Henry Clay was Speaker of the House and an avid war hawk. However, his trip to Europe as part of the Ghent Peace Committee seemed to convince him to lay down the sword and release the dove. Throughout the rest of his life, Henry Clay would be an active voice in the Senate, convincing throes of senators throughout generations to seek compromises to avoid war. He became known as the Great Compromiser, negotiating the three aforementioned compromises. Clay sought to take any method which might prevent war, as he journals in his speech to Congress before the Compromise of 1850. If the Union is to be dissolved for any existing causes, it will be dissolved because slavery is interdicted, or not allowed to be introduced into the ceded territories, because slavery is threatened to be abolished in the District of Columbia, and because fugitive slaves are not returned, as in my opinion they ought to be, and restored to their masters. These, I believe, will be the causes, if there be any causes, which can lead to the direful event to which I have referred. So, Clay supported slavery? I mean, he did support the fugitive slave laws chronicled in the Compromise of 1850. Not exactly. Clay was willing to support any ideal which could prevent the war, even if that meant allowing slavery to exist in the present state. Remember, Clay was from Kentucky, and thus, as a Senate member should, he was representing the platforms of his state. I see. So he was kind of a snake. Kind of. Clay's personal magnetism made him one of America's best-loved politicians. However, his elaborate scheming made him one of the most cordially hated. Well said. Thank you.
Unfortunately for Henry Clay, the issue of slavery sought to resolve itself sooner rather than later. The conflict would continue to escalate, and one woman would contribute to the beginning of the Civil War more than any debate or law passed in Congress, through the written word rather than the spoken one. This woman was Harriet Beecher Stowe, daughter of the Second Great Awakening and godmother to the abolitionist movement. Stowe would write a hugely controversial book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, about slave conditions in the Deep South. Controversial because of the concepts the book assumed about slavery, the book was outlawed in the South. However, it became hugely popular in the North, fueling abolitionist movements and even spread across the Atlantic Ocean, where it became widely sold in Great Britain. Perhaps the mildest form of the system of slavery is to be seen in the state of Kentucky. The general prevalence of agricultural pursuits of a quiet and gradual nature, not requiring those periodic seasons of hurry and pressure that are called for in the business of more southern districts, makes the task of the Negro a more healthful and reasonable one, while the master, content to a more gradual style of acquisition, has not those temptations to hard-heartedness which always overcome frail human nature when the prospect of sudden and rapid gain is weighed in the balance, with no heavier counterpoise than the interests of the helpless and unprotected.
Stowe's book continues to sell millions of copies to this day, bringing slavery closer to each new generation. So it seems like all we've been talking about today is politics. The Constitution, the Cabinet, slavery, the establishment of the colonies. When are we going to stray away from government and start talking about the real people? Well, I'm glad you asked that, Tom, as we're gonna take a closer look at one of the greatest financial geniuses of all time, and a local of Pittsburgh, although originally from Scotland, Andrew Carnegie. The same guy who plastered his name across half the buildings in Pittsburgh? The very same. Born in Scotland, Andrew Carnegie moved to America, and after working a series of railroad jobs, finally amassed enough capital to start investing in the railroad business. After numerous well-invested movements, he was able to move out of the railroad business and start a company of his own, Carnegie Steel. Through the process he pioneered as vertical consolidation, Carnegie Steel came to own every part of the process of steel production, from the mining to the distribution. However, the companies faced several strikes due to poor working conditions, and it was charged with several counts of employee abuse due to those conditions. The Homestead Strike is the most violent event of the period, which embodied the tenuous relationship Carnegie had with his workers. Looking to government, Carnegie became the voice of big business, speaking in the defense of millionaires like himself who come under the face of public scrutiny. In this excerpt from one of Carnegie's essays, he speaks of the philanthropic efforts which people who have come into money should undergo. Individualism will continue, but the millionaire will be but a trustee for the poor, entrusted for a season with a great part of the increased wealth of the community, but administering it for the community far better than it could or would have done it for itself. The best minds will thus have reached a stage in the development of the race in which it is clearly seen that there is no mode of disposing with the surplus wealth creditable to thoughtful and earnest men, into whose hands it flows, save by using it year by year for the general good. If you want to take a closer look at the mark Carnegie left on Pittsburgh, all it takes is a stroll around the city. There's the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, next to the Carnegie Library, in front of Carnegie Music Hall. In New York, there's another Carnegie Music Hall, and further down Forbes Avenue in our Pittsburgh, we have the Carnegie Mellon University. If you take a right from Forbes Avenue onto Boundary Street, you will have the Carnegie Museum of Art directly to your left. And if you go all the way to Heinz Field, you will be standing next to the Carnegie Science Center. Catch my drift? With the seventh person in our presentation, we take a turn from the lawful into the unlawful. This American may have killed and otherwise broken countless laws, however the shadow he left over Chicago remains today. In the dark side of American history, we look at none other than the great mobster, Al Capone. So, Al Capone was a bad guy, right? I mean, he did lead one of the most brutal mobs in Chicago history. He was definitely a bad guy to some and a good guy to others. On the one hand, Al Capone's mob history cannot be forgotten, and yet through his money laundering he ended up donating thousands of jobs to the Chicago community, not to mention several philanthropic efforts which he spearheaded. Born in 1899 in Brooklyn, New York to poor immigrant parents, Al Capone went on to become one of the most infamous gangsters in American history. In 1920, through the height of Prohibition, Capone's multi-million-dollar Chicago operation in bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling dominated the organized crime scene. Capone was responsible for many brutal acts of violence, mainly against other gangsters. The most famous of these was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, in which he ordered the assassination of 7 rivals. Capone was never indicted for his racketeering, but he was finally brought to justice for income tax evasion in 1931. After serving 6.5 years, Capone was released. He died in 1947 in Miami. Capone's life captured the public imagination, and his gangster persona has been immortalized in many movies and books inspired by his exploits. Al Capone's trial was covered by media across the country, with throngs of eager Americans vying for his arrest. However, his seemingly untouchable nature put a damper on the prosecution. While the defense took only 1 day, prosecution took almost 2 years preparing their case. Finally, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury put forth this statement. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty as charged in indictment number 22852, and we find the defendant guilty on counts 1, 5, 9, 13, and 18, and not guilty on counts 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, 19, 20, 21, and 22. For this verdict, Judge Wilkerson sentenced Capone to 11 years in prison with no prospect of bail, thus ending the gangster's decade of crime and electoral fraud. So, Al Capone, the most notorious gangster, and the Godfather, right? No, that was Frank Costello with the Genovese crime family. It's a good example of how crime ran rampant throughout the Prohibition time period. Alright, so that is a terrifying example of other people which impacted American history. Can we go to a lighter note? How much lighter do you want? How about, wasn't film gaining popularity during this time period? Yes, do you have a person in mind? Ooh, I remember religiously watching Disney movies as a kid. So let's take a closer look at the man who kick-started the multi-billion-dollar brand that would come to rule the cinematic sphere. Born in Chicago, Walt Disney moved to Los Angeles at age 22 and joined his brother Roy in creating Disney Brothers Studio. Advancing the style and technology of animation, this studio produced many popular films. Disney forever altered the mass media entertainment industry by pioneering product merchandising linked to his cartoon characters and by creating Disneyland, the theme park that quickly became a symbol of childhood innocence, American ingenuity, and rampant capitalism. Short animated cartoons had become popular years before Walt Disney produced Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937. Mickey Mouse, Disney's most famous character, first appeared in 1928, among many other cartoon figures of the Great Depression. As Americans needed to escape from economic difficulties, they increasingly sought the enjoyment of animated films. These shorts were played prior to full-length motion pictures in hundreds of theaters across the country. As the first feature-length animated picture with color and sound, Snow White marked a distinct break with the press. Not content with impacting American history, Walt Disney was chronicled by the 1937 edition of Time magazine. Even artists say that Walter Elias Disney is an artist. Some go further, say that he is a great one. Certainly his works are better known and more widely appreciated than those of any other artist in history. 3 weeks ago, his Mickey Mouse created a minor government crisis in Yugoslavia. Last year, as Mickey's son, he was Japan's patron saint. In Russia, the works of Disney are appreciated as social satire, depicting the capitalist world under the mask of mice and pigs. The late George V, it said, would not go to a cinema performance unless it included a Disney film. Disney was a genius, not only in product creation but also in its marketing. Throughout his product merchandising, he was able to accrue an immense fortune, valued today at $5 billion adjusted for inflation. In addition to that, he created an empire that would far outlive him and diversify into other fields with theme parks, toy production, and even a cruise line. Man, I love Disney movies. But do you know what's even better? Pixar movies. Well, in reality, Pixar movies are Disney movies. The studio was bought out in 2006, and even before that it enjoyed a healthy partnership with a company where Disney owned the rights to all of Pixar's movies. Pixar movies are great and all, but, Marvel! Their movies are awesome! Actually, Marvel's been a Disney subsidiary since 2009. The producing giant has accumulated over 20% of the overall movie share, the largest producer in the business. Wow, that's Marvel-us. You said it. With the 20th century came many social movements. Women's suffrage was granted in 1920, alcohol was outlawed across the nation in 1919, and various Hispanic groups sought recognition of their rights as citizens. I had a dream that this guy would be on here. One of the most famous civil movements of the time was by a group present before the Irish, before the Germans, and before the Scots and the Spanish, first arriving all the way back in 1619 and even before the birth of William Penn, the second person on our list. The African American Civil Rights Movement gained tremendous support during the era of good feelings which follows any major war, in this case, World War II. Martin Luther King was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. King, both a Baptist minister and civil rights activist, had a seismic impact on race relations in the United States, beginning in the mid-1950s. Among many efforts, King headed the SCLC. Throughout his activism, he played a pivotal role in ending the legal segregation of African American citizens in the South and other voting areas of the nation, as well as the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, among several other honors. King was assassinated in April 1968 and continues to be remembered as one of the most lauded African American leaders in history, often referenced by his 1963 speech, "I Have a Dream." In the speech, King Jr. describes his vision for the future of African Americans in America. I'll let him tell it.
In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that this Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give upon us, demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
Martin Luther King Jr., although dying a martyr, was able to achieve his goal of equal rights regardless of skin color, notably through peaceful protest. In a time when many major social changes would be fought out to a resolution, King was able to achieve his goals through a way in which he was eventually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, it's been a fun ride, but shouldn't we give a shout out to the technological industry without which this wouldn't be possible? Tom, I couldn't agree more. After all, we do live in the Silicon Age. Let's take our final flashback in history to a simpler time when computers were all but a luxury limited to the big businesses and the rich. Back then, two men oversaw the change to a more personal computer, and the media made their rivalry nothing less than biblical. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs have a long history filled with many stark similarities and just as many lucid differences. While one needs to look no further than their own pocket or the person sitting next to them to see the winner of the company battle, Bill Gates had a greater impact on American history than Steve Jobs. His cooperation with numerous other tech companies and his innovation, which later inspired Jobs to create similar products of his own, led to a legacy befitting of the richest man in the world at one point in his life. Bill Gates is a technologist, business leader, and a philanthropist. He grew up in Seattle, Washington, with a family who encouraged his interest in computers at an early age. He dropped out of Harvard University to start Microsoft with his childhood friend, Paul Allen. He married Melinda French in 1994, and together they had 3 children. Today, Bill and Melinda Gates co-chair the charitable foundation bearing their names and are working together to give their wealth back to society. Bill Gates' philanthropic pursuits are highlighted in his annual address to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Although the acute financial crisis is over, the economy is still weak, and the world will spend a lot of years undoing the damage, which includes lingering unemployment and huge government deficits and debts at record levels. Later in the letter, I'll talk more about the effects of these deficits on governments' foreign aid budgets. Despite the tough economy, I am still very optimistic about the progress we can make in the years ahead. A combination of scientific innovations and great leaders who are working on behalf of the world's poorest people will continue to improve the human condition. And those are 10 of the most influential people in US history. Thanks for watching tonight. And be sure to stay tuned for the next episode where we answer viewer response questions such as, why are your videos so long? Don't you know that this is just an Athens project? And finally, why is everyone in your video the same person? Thanks for watching!